We're here to make a new type of news. New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's June 8th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yoon, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Ji-Hee.
Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday, and Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. The first story. Earlier this month, Korean Air posted photos of a luxurious private jet set aside just for K-pop girl group Blackpink. The photos show how each member has personalized yellow bags, name cards, and stuffed animals. Korean Air on Wednesday said they provide premium business jet services to people who spend more than $500,000 per year. Then they'd be able to enjoy 30 hours of flights. You have to pay thousands of dollars extra depending on whether you're flying domestic or international. Moving on, Ukrainian tennis player Alina Svitolina has made it clear that she wouldn't be shaking hands with Russian or Belarusian players considering the ongoing war in her home country. That's why she was a bit disturbed when her Belarusian opponent, Arina Sabalenka, waited at the net for a handshake after their French Open tie. Soon after, fans booed the Ukrainian player off the court. Svitolina later told reporters that she thought her Belarusian opponent was stirring up unnecessary tension. Now, recently, a YouTuber who revealed the identity of the so-called Busan roundhouse kicker said he had received a notification from YouTube restricting him from generating any money from his videos. The YouTuber, under the name Caracula Detective Agency, revealed the identity of a man who assaulted a woman in her 20s by doing a roundhouse kick to her head. The alleged assailant is currently appealing a sentence for rape and attempted murder. We're going to dig a bit deeper into the third hashtag. Many have expressed their rage after hearing Caracula, the YouTuber who disclosed the info of the Busan roundhouse kick assailant, had been penalized. Now, he could actually be arrested for defamation because it's actually only up to the police and prosecutors to disclose assailant's personal info when they think the degree of the crime is way too grave or when they want to prevent the suspect from ever committing another crime. And that's why many netizens have actually stood on the side of Caracula, saying he deserves applause. But what are your thoughts on this issue, Walter?
Well, obviously, the main issue is the attack on the woman, and we hope that she is making a full recovery. And that's obviously horrible, but it is a very difficult one. That I do believe that Caracula Detective Agency, though it's a YouTube channel, I believe that he is a licensed private investigator slash detective. Therefore, he's allowed to run his a legal business in South Korea. But even though he's running his business, he does need to follow South Korean laws and guidelines. And in South Korea, it does stipulate under the Act on Special Cases concerning the punishment of specific violent crimes cases, and another act as well, there's a criteria before a person's identity can be disclosed, one of which is sufficient evidence shall exist to prove that the criminal suspect has committed the crime. Now, the person is still under trial, therefore he's still technically innocent until proven guilty. And therefore it's a terrible crime, but he's still technically protected under the law.
He is a defendant and he's still undergoing trial. And that's why another worrisome angle is that though the info of a suspect or criminal has been revealed, and when it's done through these unofficial processes, there are some things that are overlooked. For this case, pictures of the assailant's supposed ex-girlfriend have also gone viral. So what do you think about these overlooked factors, Ji-Hee?
Well, we witness acts of vigilante justice like these quite often.
We do.
This refers to individuals, them punishing the offenders themselves because there's perceived lack of punishment under the law. While the alleged offender's details have not been revealed yet, once the court decision on the appeal of the case is made on Monday, I believe, his personal info may be officially revealed as a sex offender.
Right.
Now, but with the assailant's supposed ex-girlfriend's pictures going viral, like you said, we have to remember, the netizens and ourselves have to remember the initial purpose of having revealed the information of this offender, because it was to protect the victim and reveal his identity so that no other victims could arise from this.
Right.
But people like his ex-girlfriend shouldn't really be affected by what he did.
Because they have nothing to do with this case whatsoever. They're not directly tied into it, and they might just be as innocent as any other civilian may be. It's just in a quarter of a day, their lives have been revealed to the public. And that was our news feed for this Thursday. Thursday, we're going to swiftly move on to our discussion topic. We're going to be talking about a thorny issue that has many different aspects. It's juvenile justice. Take a look at the screen to find out more. Kids require protection, no doubt. But should they be let off the hook even if they commit serious crimes? Well, in Korea, if you're under the age of 14, you'll be considered a juvenile. In other words, you won't receive criminal disposition if you've committed crimes. The number of juvenile cases has jumped by 86% last year compared to 5 years ago. Experts are more concerned about how grave the crimes are getting. We're seeing more minors exploit their juvenile status to get away with assault, sometimes even murder. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. Because of how severe the crimes committed by juveniles are getting, some are demanding that the maximum criminal exemption age be brought down from 14 to 13. What does our generation think about that? 2, another central part of this issue is how society should be guiding these teens. What's the best way to protect and rehabilitate these minors? 3, how are other countries dealing with juvenile cases? Is any country particularly successful? Year after year, we're seeing more minors commit criminal activities, but they're getting off the hook because of how young they are. So the public has been asking what age is too young to be a criminal. Officials have accordingly been discussing whether to reduce the minimum age of criminal responsibility, as you've seen in the video, which is currently 14 here. So before I ask our panelists here in the studio what they think about this issue, Chi, why don't you walk us through just how many juvenile cases have we been seeing to the extent that the public has been demanding that the criminal responsibility age be brought down?
Well, the number of juvenile cases has been increasing year by year in the country, and these include violent crimes, including rape, robbery, and even murder. And according to data, juvenile crime cases in 2021 was a little over 12,500, and the number increased to almost 17,000 in 2022. And even last year's number of cases was the highest in 10 years.
Highest, wow.
And also the number of articles related to juvenile cases increased by 5-fold. It used to be 404 in 7 years ago, but that increased by 5 times in 2022. And even recently, a video of a 13-year-old swearing and even kicking a police officer went viral online as well.
And I remember we mentioned that in our news feed here on one of our episodes, and we talked about how minors might be taking it for granted with their juvenile status and everything, and how they won't be sentenced like an adult offender. And they are disrespecting police and authorities, which is quite outraging in my opinion. But why don't you, Walter, walk us through on how serious of an issue juvenile cases are becoming in Korea?
Yeah, so obviously the first things that we think about are obviously violent crimes, probably under the influence. But as we know, it's getting to the point where it's now like, yes, murder, drugs, there's a problem with narcotics coming into the country, as well as probably one of the most, the biggest concern these days is what's happening online. So, example, sexual exploitation, prostitution as well. There was obviously the huge Telegram case that happened.
Room case.
That was massive, and that was, though that person wasn't a minor, minors were involved in the cases as well. So it's not just the violent crimes that we should be focusing on, but all crimes, including getting monetized for these certain sexual crimes.
Exactly. Not only happening in the physical front, but we're also seeing it happen in the cyber front, which is why authorities are having more difficulty finding who is involved and actually detecting them and penalizing them. But as I mentioned before, a big part of this issue is whether we should bring down the age of when we can consider a minor to be a criminal and then sentence them like any other adult offender. So what is your stance on this relatively thorny question?
Well, like you said earlier, there have been continued public calls to bring down the minimum age of criminal responsibility. The argument is that the current age, which is 14 here in Korea, was decided in 1958, and that was 64 years ago. So the psychological and physical development of children could be a lot different from then and now. However, some others are against the idea of lowering the age because they say that we should understand how less experienced children are and less likely they are to make rational decisions compared to adults. So really, probation can help juvenile offenders rehabilitate,
Right.
And criminal law isn't always effective in deterring crimes among teenagers. And I also agree with keeping the current age because of these reasons. Also, if we take a look at the numbers, those between 10 and 13, they account for only about 8% of the total crime cases that's committed by juveniles, and the rest, 90%, is by those aged between 14 and 18.
All right, that's a very probable point right there. What about you, Walter?
Yeah, so I know on many popular online communities, they are all for lowering the age. Now, I think a lot of netizens feel that like putting a teenager in jail or prison is a scare tactic, therefore they won't, go on to commit crimes. But in my personal opinion, it's actually not as simple as that. It's just what that is. What we need to understand is that sentencing someone like as an adult is actually extremely difficult, finding the right punishment. It's not like the TV shows where you just simply see it on the drama and then they're guilty. So obviously sentencing younger children is going to be even more difficult, or at least giving the right sort of punishment. I think lowering the age might be something that the government might consider, but they shouldn't see this as an answer to reduce the crime rate, because it won't. Most, if not all teenagers, they know what they're doing, I think. And like, I was a teen once, I did bad things as well, but believe it or not, like, to be a criminal, you have to have some sort of intelligence to know what you're doing wrong. And I guess it just comes down to the type of, let's say, punishment that needs to be considered.
There's a lot of weight to your arguments because I know you're a criminology major, right?
Yeah.
So that's good there. But as you mentioned, this doesn't seem to be the only way to go, lowering the age of when you can consider one to be a criminal, because we've been seeing underage crimes grow crueler and more violent over the years. And I think this issue should touch upon better reform policies. At the end of the day, it's not just about putting youth at these detention centers or making them subject to criminal law. It's making sure that they're reformed. And in order for us to do that, I think we need better policies, whether that be, boosting up these detection rates or making sure that we have better rehabilitation programs. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I totally agree with you, Yoon. I recently had the chance to interpret for this NGO who's for abolishing all death penalty in the world. And what I learned from them is that it's not about the intensity of the punishment that scares the criminals. And it's really, what's more important is training them and helping them reintegrate into society. And also, I mean, what they're scared of is the fact that they will get punished, not how strong that is. So lowering the age or merely sentencing these offenders won't be the only effective means of helping them out. And also, in the end, after their sentencement, for example, they will have to return to society.
They do.
Right. So we really have to help them rehabilitate. And this, in fact, lowers recidivism as well.
For sure. And I'm all for the carrot and stick theory. I mean, the stick could be not only these penalties we're talking about, but it could be high detection rates. Once you know that you'll be detected for what you are doing, that could stop you. And as for the carrot, you need to know that there's hope for you once you come out of these detention centers. But what is your thought on this issue?
Well, I actually completely agree with Chi. And when we talked quickly about that NGO, I found it very interesting. But it really does depend on the crime. We are knowing that the crimes are getting more violent, but there are also minor crimes like drinking, smoking, etc. And there should be also ways that we handle those sort of crimes as well. But as I mentioned earlier, the more serious the crime, I think things like interventions, education, rehabilitation is key.
For sure. And why don't we compare our country with other countries by seeing how others are dealing with juvenile crimes?
Right. So compared to other countries, underage offenders in Korea are receiving protective dispositions at the level of a retribution. In Germany, offenders younger than 14 are protected by the welfare ministry without a protective disposition. And if we take a look at the minimum age of criminal responsibility for other countries such as the US, which is different for each state, France, China, the UK, and Australia have lower ages compared to Korea. However, there's no data indicating that these countries have less number of juvenile cases, meaning the age really doesn't matter in reducing the number of cases.
For sure. But what what about you? Could you add a few other countries too?
Yeah, well, for Denmark in particular, they have attempted to lower the age down to 14, and this was back in 2010, 2012, but this move was obviously by the Danish politicians to try and, I guess, deter youth from committing crime, but actually, the results suggested that there was no general deterrent effect. In fact, during that period, the recidivism rate increased by 10% amongst 14-year-olds. So that's quite interesting that there was more of an increase rather than a decrease.
Both fascinating points you guys made just there. And we're going to add a legal expert in our talks to find out what the laws are like in Australia and whether South Korea could use that as a blueprint for any policies or related legislation here. To find out whether South Korea is going in the right direction in terms of youth justice, we're going to compare our policies with those in Australia. Let's hear from Dr. Stephen Monterosso, a senior lecturer at Curtin Law School in Perth. Welcome, Dr. Monterosso.
Good morning.
All right, so Dr. Monterosso, I'd like to ask you the first question. What are the youth crime figures like in Australia, and have the figures been growing over the years? And from what age are juveniles considered criminals there?
Interestingly, I guess if you ask the average person in the street, they'd be quite shocked to hear this, but youth crime rates aren't actually increasing at all. They're actually either steady or declining. Doesn't appear that way, as I said, to the average person in the street. What we've sort of seen recently is some quite alarming isolated incidents in certain regional areas with real lawlessness amongst juveniles, and I've even seen car chases, this time the juveniles chasing the police, would you believe, in stolen cars, which is quite amazing to me from what I remember of when I was a child, what was on the news in those days. So I think overall our rates are either steady or in decline. In terms of the criminal responsibility age, ours is actually quite low at 10, but there's been vociferous criticism of Australia for a long, long time, not least of which from the United Nations, the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They've been vocal in their criticism of our low age for a long time now. And so there's moves finally amongst the Attorney Generals to actually increase the age of criminal responsibility to 14. Hasn't happened yet, and I believe there's not much happening at the moment, but some of the states, bearing in mind Australia's federation, so we have criminal responsibility is state-based, of course. So there's a few individual states who've actually raised to 12 and are talking about raising to 14. So it's quite interesting. I think it's good that Korea has the 14 age criminal responsibility level. And I know there's been some criticism lately, and I believe there's been criticism from academics rather, and so on and so forth. But in my view, it will not lead to reduced crimes. In fact, it may well do the opposite.
But I do wonder if the criminal responsibility age in Australia being so low and everything is actually allowing the criminal rates to be so low amongst youth. That's a question I have, but I think it segues into Chihi's, right?
Right. So what penalties then are slapped upon minors in Australia? How many years can you get for serious crimes like murder?
Well, technically, the penalty for murder is always life. It's really a matter of the non-parole period. So in terms of juvenile murderers, there are some, of course, and have been some commissions of murders over the years, but they typically don't get anywhere near the adults, if you like, levels of incarceration. So in recent times here in Perth, there was a young person accused of murder. They were tried and they were actually convicted of manslaughter, and they only received about, I think it was 7 years, or might have been 4 years, to be honest. So it's not as cut and dried as we would imagine. So the criminal responsibility age, for example, in the UK, it had been reduced to 10 after that terrible James Bulger incident way back in the 90s, you might remember. But now there's talk of raising it back up to 14. So it's a difficult issue, and I think it's in terms of responsibility, I understand that the average person in the street thinking this actually works, but I'm not so convinced myself.
Okay.
And I guess I would have to talk about like social media quickly. With a lot of people uploading things on social media, they actually see what these children are up to, and therefore they think that in their neighborhood these crimes are occurring. But like you said, it's not actually happening as much. But what do you think is the most important thing to consider to bring youth crime rates down?
What I think is, I think the justice model versus the welfare model, that there's a tension there. So, I mean, academics, we get accused of all these leftist kind of attitudes and so on, but really, I'm a fan of the restorative justice movement, which is a different take on analysing crime and dealing with crime. So, rather than, let's say, increased sentencing, the restorative movement looks at focusing on the crime itself and actually getting people together, the victims, the offenders, sometimes even property owners, business owners, families, that kind of thing, to come up with a more collective solution. Now, when a lot of people hear this, they think, well, this is just crazy. This is just being, overly liberal. But what actually happens is the offender has to admit guilt in the first place before they can be dealt with under restorative justice principles. So I think, and I've noticed some of your comments earlier when I was listening, that rehabilitation and reform, that is the key, not so much punitive policing, because that's never been proven to be actually effective. And as I said, it appeals to a lot of people, but the criminal mind doesn't quite work the same way as a normal person, if you like. So they're not actually thinking of penalties when they're committing crimes. For example, bank robbers aren't consulting the criminal code when they're planning a bank robbery. They don't think they're going to get caught. That's the problem.
Right.
So I think that reducing recidivism is a very good way of reducing overall offending, because when people are exposed to detention, they actually often come out worse. And if we expose juveniles to severe types of detention, you can almost guarantee that they will come out worse. And we should also remember that, I guess we should also remember that most people are going to be released. There's very few lifers out there in around the world. So if they're going to come out, we'd like them to come out better than they went in. And that's where rehabilitation and reform gets involved, in my view. I think that's the key.
Exactly. Remember the 2 R's, reform and rehabilitation. Thank you so much, Dr. Monterosso. Learned so much from you today.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
And Dr. Monterosso mentioned a lot of great points. And before we end off, Walter, why don't you give us your final thought? What do you think needs to be done then to prevent or stop more juveniles from committing crimes here in Korea?
I guess you have to listen to the doctor, and I do completely agree with him. The early intervention is ideal. If the parent or the child are truly concerned about their child, they need to intervene in some way. I mean, understandably, no good parent wants to, dob or put their child into the police, but it's the only way.
It is the only way. All right, that's all we have for you today, and we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Choi Ji-hee.
Thank you.
And Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.